So, what if I want to go back into the narcissistic relationship? Let's take that on. Try these on for size. I love him. I love her. They're my family. They're trying. I miss them. Your reasons are your reasons. And because of that, they're fine. There's no judgment. But one question I often get is, can I love the narcissistic person? And the answer to that is obviously yes. Most of us have or do, and that is what can make this all so hard. Every day in these relationships is not terrible. There's lots of history there. And especially when you're in a relationship with someone with more moderate to mild narcissism, you make it work, kind of. Love is complicated, and there are so many different kinds of love: family love, passionate love, companionate love, the love that comes from having a shared history, and all of these loves feel different. Certainly there is the hope and wish that if you do love someone in a narcissistic relationship, that it could be something different. You wish that they didn't have such a short fuse, that they weren't so selfish, that they cared a little about you or had some respect for you, but you don't want it to end. However, maybe it does end. Maybe you end it. Maybe they end it. Or you have a massive argument, or you go no contact for a while. And maybe it's days later, weeks later, months, or even years later. And you say, I want back in. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the only reason that this is happening to you is because you're trauma bonded. That's a bit reductive and too simple. It's more complicated than that. You are more complicated than that. That may be part of this. And the more you have hope that this can be different, then the more that you are likely dealing with a trauma-bonded circumstance. I recently had someone come up to me and say, Dr. Ramani, what I'm in is not an easy relationship. I have my workarounds. I still love him. Is it a problem if I stay? Does that mean that there's a problem with me? And my first thought when she said that was how much sadness I felt for someone in this situation. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. You're a problem. You think of yourself as a problem if you stay. You think of yourself as a problem if you go. You really can't win. And I told her it's not a problem. And she told me, I know. Dr. Ramani, I've read the books. I've watched the videos. I know it's not going to change. She said that she's in therapy, and she still feels what she thinks is love for him, and she doesn't want to break it up. But we talked for a while, and it was very clear she got it. In her case, she never left, right? But what if you got out or are out, whether you wanted to be out of the relationship or not, and then you have the choice in front of you to go back? What if you feel like you really want to go back? Well, here's a few tips if you're navigating this. First, if you're going to go back, don't link it to them changing. You may be being future faked. You may see little sparks of things that feel like change. But at the end of the day, I'm going to hold to my position that the narcissistic personality is stable and rigid, and their behavior and their insecurities and their reactions are not likely to change in a substantial or a sustainable way. Basically, when the going gets tough, it is going to be what it always was. So if you're going back thinking it will be better or now it will be different, tread lightly. That is not likely to happen. And if your reason for going back is because you think that now it's going to be different, that's going to be bound to be a huge disappointment. And a lot of times that can foster self-blame. The second piece is if you decide to go back, don't judge yourself. The narcissistic landscape is kind of all judgment all the time. We shame and judge ourselves for being from a family like this, for choosing someone like this, for being treated like this, for leaving, for going back, for seeing someone we're supposed to love as narcissistic, for being weak and going back in, and on, right? If you want to go back, it's okay. You may even be thinking, oh, Dr. Ramani or the other narcissism advice people are going to roll their eyes at me or disapprove. I won't. I don't. I get it. And if you judge yourself, you're already on your back foot as you think about getting back into this. If you go back in, your reasons are fine because they're your reasons. Now the people, I should say, around you judge you for leaving, and I promise you they're probably going to judge you for going back. You're never going to please other people. It's easy to judge someone when we are on the outside looking in. You may also be going back into this relationship for very practical reasons, perhaps financial reasons, or issues like culture or stigma, or other things that are very meaningful or necessary to you. Do not judge yourself. The third thing to keep in mind is the best way to think of this is that even though this isn't going to change, is that this is sort of a new relationship. Because if you are going back into it, and you are actually watching this YouTube channel, you know quite a bit more of what narcissism is and what narcissistic relationships are about. So you may see it a little bit more clearly. It may be that you can look back at a time in this relationship when you did not see it at all clearly, and now you do. You kind of have narcissism glasses that you can sort of clear it up with. So what that means is that even though you are going back, you may be going back into something where you see the patterns more clearly. It's certainly going to make it a little more uncomfortable, but that you may understand it a bit more. And while radical acceptance doesn't mean that their behavior won't hurt, hopefully it means that you may be less surprised, and you may blame yourself less, and you even may start to learn about the stuff that sets them off, and then do what you need to do at those times if you want it to work. The fourth piece to remember is you absolutely cannot isolate. And this goes back to that idea of don't judge yourself. For some folks, when they decide to go back into a narcissistic relationship, they really don't tell other people about it. At first, because they're embarrassed. You may think like, oh my gosh, I complained about this relationship so much and now I'm going back into it. People are going to think I'm a loser. So let me sort of start going back into this a little bit and see how it goes before I tell anyone. That's tricky. You need support if you're in one of these relationships. And I know this is hard, the idea of sharing it with someone, because you may feel tentative or embarrassed, or you don't want to be judged if it doesn't work out again. But the reason that narcissistic relationships can be so harmful, or that people get stuck in these cycles, is that oftentimes you get increasingly isolated from reality checks outside of them. And that isolation is both imposed by the narcissistic person and is often self-imposed from a place of our own shame. Have at least a few trusted confidants, maybe even therapy, where you can talk this out. Otherwise, you can get in your head and get very isolated, which can make you more gaslightable as you go back into this. The fifth thing to keep in mind, you have to move slow. Sometimes when you are being hoovered, especially, the narcissistic person often wants it to immediately go back, the relationship to go back to the way it was, which is not an option since that wasn't healthy. But if the relationship ended because of something particularly bad they did, like cheating or lying or abusing you in whatever other way they did, you can't unring that bell. So if you move back in or go back in, you want to take your time. You want to connect back into yourself and have, again, those touchstones like other people you talk to get those reality checks. Be careful about doing things like quickly moving back in together. They might say things like, oh, what are we wasting money on 2 rents? Be careful about spending intense amounts of time together. You got to keep some of your own stuff going for a while. Because if you do that, then they're going to gaslight you about how, oh, you really don't want to be in this if you're going so slow. Go slow. And if they don't like it, then you just got some really important information to work with. Number 6, it's okay if it doesn't work out. When people go back in a second or third or 8th time into a narcissistic relationship, they often feel even worse if it doesn't work out each subsequent time, as though everyone will see you as foolish, and you're almost hearing the whispers of, well, first time, shame on them, second time, shame on you. Listen, it's like other things. Sometimes with all you know about narcissism and what qualifies as healthy in a relationship and paying attention to the patterns more carefully, now you may see it more clearly. Maybe they had to escalate to doing worse and worse things, which I hope to heaven don't physically hurt you. They've already psychologically hurt you. These relationships, though, sometimes have, not sometimes, almost always, have sort of a rock bottom to them. And you just can't endure it anymore. And that rock bottom, though, is different for everyone, and everyone has a different response to it. There gets to a point when we look at the behavior in these relationships where sometimes you just can't unsee it. And it's okay if you went back in and it doesn't work out. Now you may have more resolve based on the new things that happen to not get back in. Number 7, don't call yourself a codependent if you go back in. It's a common sort of positioning. I'm going back. I love them because I'm a codependent. You probably aren't. And when you use this kind of language like codependency, then you sort of take on that identity. And then it becomes a sort of, well, of course I'm in this kind of messed up relationship. That's because I'm a codependent. Love is a complicated emotion, and the circumstances surrounding love are complicated. And it can all get confused with other emotions and beliefs like pity, guilt, obligation, familiarity, fear. Take a minute to ask yourself if you're going back because you love them. What do you really mean by love? Is it okay if this relationship is asymmetric? Is it okay if this relationship is only good some of the time? Or does love mean something else? Most people who go back into narcissistic relationships are not codependents. People go back for a lot of complicated reasons. And making it as simple as everyone who goes back into a narcissistic relationship is a codependent is overly simplifying and deeply insulting. And all of this looks different depending on whether the relationship you're wanting to go back to is a family member, and perhaps you're going back in after a period of no contact or a terrible fight, or maybe it's with a friend you had distanced from. Usually when we have this sort of formula of going back in, we're thinking about intimate relationships. But for some of you, it may be that sense of, I vowed I would not start engaging with my mother again, and yet here I am doing it. So the going back in has a different vibe for all different kinds of relationships. You may go back in and stay in the narcissistic relationship. And you may find that you were able to find social support, that you now understand the narcissistic person's limitations, that you aren't personalizing their insults and criticisms and abuses, that you learn their triggers, you learn their sensitivities, you don't fall for the gaslighting. It's sure as hell not perfect. And it may not be, for example, the family you would have liked to have come from or the marriage you hoped for. But for reasons that are yours, you try to make it work for you. And maybe going back works out for you. But it only, quote unquote, works if you really see it clearly. Someone else recently asked me, Dr. Ramani, isn't ignorance better? Not understanding narcissism and then not getting lost in knowing it won't change and feeling stupid for thinking it will. Hope is not stupid. It makes sense, but hope is also dangerous. Ignorance isn't better because you end up being surprised a lot and even more hurt and more confused and more likely to blame yourself. That's not good. Oftentimes, going back into one of these relationships can often just be more of a devil you know situation. While the primary harm of the narcissistic relationship comes from the narcissistic person's behavior, the secondary harms come from the shame that we carry in these relationships around every single thing we do. Whether it's staying, whether it's going back in, whether it's thinking we're disloyal for thinking this person that we're supposed to love is narcissistic, whether it's blaming ourselves or thinking we're the problem. If you want to go back, sit with it, think on it, and don't shame yourself and think you're stupid or foolish or crazy or a codependent or a masochist. You're just a human being who loves or cares about another person, and it's not exactly the way you wanted, and that other person doesn't always treat you well. And that is a lot to navigate for anyone. Healing starts with being nicer to yourself, because the narcissistic person won't do it for you. And keep in mind one final point. All of this is predicated that this relationship is not physically dangerous. Obviously, a pull to go back into a relationship where there's been physical violence, significant physical threats, those sorts of things, or children could be in harm's way. That's not what this is about. In those cases, it's really about finding ways to get you out and keep you out. And that means things like domestic violence, resources, or anything to keep you safe. And to that end, in the notes section of this video, we do have some information on those resources. But in many cases, that's what narcissistic relationships are not about that. They're about these sorts of 1,000 cuts. Whether it's death by 1,000 cuts or whatever it may be, it's complicated. And sometimes people say, well, it seems like the only thing we're supposed to do is leave these. It's too simple. And if you're going to get pulled in and you feel like you want to go back in, I'd rather you got back into one of these relationships with your eyes wide open, with information and with support. When you have all of those things, this will feel different. And then you'll see where it goes. Thanks again.